Hello and welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson. This week, an addition to the Cornish material, which will be eventually gathered together into a Gazzetta for Ars Magica 5th edition. Looe Island is a potential Covenant site. Much of this material comes from Alex Langston's book From Granite to Sea, or from the Cornish folklore journal that he edits, which is called Lien Gweren. For the spellings of those, I suggest you check the notes in the blog that accompanies the podcast. I apologise for my hopeless Cornish pronunciation. Looe Island has a Cornish name, which means the island of the monks' enclosure that I'm not going to attempt. In English, it's either called St. George's Island or St. Michael's Island in period, but given how many monastic islands of St. Michael we are already struggling with, let's just go with the modern name, which is of a nearby town, Looe. It's on the south coast of Cornwall, toward the eastern end, which places it away from Tintagel and Scilly, which are the other two sites I'm considering developing. The island is about 22 acres in area, so it's large enough to sustain a Covenant's population, particularly given the resources of the sea and trade with nearby ports. Looe, the nearest modern port, doesn't seem to exist as a legal entity in 1220, but it may be one of the many boroughs that Richard of the Romans sets up slightly after the game period starts. He does seem to give Looe a fair, for example. There is a settlement on site before the Normans turn up, and part of what's now Looe is made up of 3 Doomsday Book manors, one of which was directly owned by William the Conqueror himself, although he had a steward there. There is a second smaller islet near Looe. It's called Trelawney Island now, but that's a very recent change. Well, 40 years ago. Recent by Ars Magica standards. Historically, it seems to have been called Little Island. It's close enough that it's connected with a simple footbridge, and large enough that Magi might build a separate domicile there if they preferred to live physically separated from their community. The island is identified by some writers with Ictus, the place where the ancient Cornish set up a trading post to sell tin to international traders. There are some features which don't match the description given in Diodorus Siculus. Ictus is meant to be tidal, for example, but for the purposes of the game, that link could be made. It certainly appears in period because the Cornish people believe that Joseph of Arimathea left his nephew, Jesus Christ, on this island for a while when he came to Cornwall to buy tin along the coast. This has made pilgrimage to the island popular from early times, but not popular in the Britain-wide sense. It seems to be a local phenomenon. Regardless, Insula Ictus would be a fine name for a Covenant here. The island belongs to Glastonbury Abbey. They took control of it in 1144 in real Europe. It's administered by 2 Benedictines who live there at the St. Michael of Lamanna Priory. I apologise for the pronunciation again. In the real world, Glastonbury Abbey sold the entire island to a local landowner in, I know it's say 1286, but there's a little bell ringing in my head indicating that could be wrong. The priory was small and then became a secular chapel, possibly dedicated to St. Michael. Glastonbury, you may recall, is the abbey that was so fortunate as to discover the tomb of King Arthur in its garden about 40 game years ago, and it's lucky for them that their good fortune has continued to extend to the point where the only part of the British Isles that Jesus is known to have walked on during his life is under their control. How lucky they are. A pair of Victorian antiquarians said that Looe has man-made caves in it, similar to the grottos of the Etruscans. I've been trying to work up the Etruscans into game material for, well, some time now, because they give us a new source for an early published NPC. In Sanctuary of Ice, I developed a 2-line description of Jonathan Tweets, an archmagus skilled in lightning magic raised as a Titalis. The Etruscans might serve as the ancestors of his tradition. The last mention of the Etruscan magi I can find is from 408, when the Visigoths came to sack Rome. The Romans heard that the Visigothic forces had been scattered from about a town called Narnia, strangely enough, which is modern Narni in Italy, by a magical ritual that had called down lightning. The priests of the old religion, who were Etruscan haruspexes, came to the Pope, I believe it was Innocent I, but I need to check, And they said, "We can save your city by performing the same ritual." The Pope said yes, but he demanded that they do it in secret, or at least in private, and the Haruspexians refused and then left. There is some question as to how the story played out. There are a couple of different versions, but regardless, there were lightning magi actively destroying armies in the 5th century. The Etruscans had other features that seemed vaguely hermetic. They had comparatively egalitarian sexes compared to the Greeks or the Romans. They lived in small city-states ruled by a tiny oligarchic caste rather than the monarchic states which were surrounding them. They lived in the area of modern Italy that was the source of copper and tin, so there's a sort of link there. They're best known in the modern day for their cavernous decorated graves, some of which I could place inside the island. In later periods, smugglers worked on Looe Island and spread tales of ghosts to frighten off people who might otherwise be curious as to their lights and noise at night. In mythic Europe, that's how you attract fairies. There are at least 3 Looe ghosts, which may be fairies. The first is a dark-skinned man with blood on his face. The second is an aristocratic, long-fingered man with grey hair who emerges from a blue light. That blue light may be a version of the Cornish will-o'-the-wisp, which I'll cover somewhere else. Langston's description seems to suggest that this ghost is from after the game's period, but I need material, so let's lever him in. There's also a white hare which warns of storms and is the spirit of a girl who committed suicide when she was wronged or abandoned by her suitor. Apparently this happens a lot in Cornwall, so there are several of these hares about. I like them as potential familiars. In wrapping up, I'd once again like to mention Langston's book. He's not a sponsor, by the way. His book reuses material from some of the other sources that we've been digging through for the Cornish Gazetteer, Hunt, Bottrell, Quiller Couch. However, they had an older, somewhat more florid writing style, and he's more modern and direct. Similarly, his work contains folk tales that are post-period, and generally, rather than retrofitting the tales by changing a Puritan over to an ancient Catholic, or by changing a Roundhead to some earlier military man, I've just excluded that material. So there is a lot of extra Cornish setting material there. It may be worth a look if you're interested in that style of historical research to add depth to your game. I believe the publisher is Troy Books. So next month, back with the start of the Bottrell series. Bottrell did 3 volumes of Cornish material. Some of it he collected for Robert Hunt, and you've already seen in the Hunt episodes. Those will dash through quite quickly. His 3rd volume was incomplete because he suffered a stroke during its preparation, or an elf shot, as we would call it in Ars Magica, and he had a beautiful obituary piece written for him, which describes all of the creatures of Cornish folklore gathering around his grave to say goodbye to him. But anyway, beginning to ramble, so your saga may vary.